Hi, folks. Welcome to Empowering Democracy. I'm Joe Firestone, your host. Okay, tonight we'll be dealing again with Dump the Corruption because the Supreme Court has been a victim of the corruption in the American system. But more relevantly, I suppose, hey, Steve, how are you? Thanks for coming. Uh, okay, more relevantly, though, perhaps, what the Supreme Court has been doing for a very long time now has been undermining democracy. I suppose on the theory, the Federalist Society theory, that the United States is not a democracy but a republic. Uh, those people have never recognized that we evolved into a democratic republic, and that element on the Supreme Court has been trying to turn back the clock to the public we had before Franklin D. Roosevelt. Uh, we will not empower democracy until we disempower the Supreme Court. And the reasons why that is true are made perfectly plain in a very good article that was written by Tom Hartman. It appeared in Raw Story, or I picked it up in Raw Story. And the title of the article is What the Supreme Court Did to America When They Legalized Political Bribery. And I will read through the article with running commentary on it here tonight. It's a very long article and will probably occupy most of the show, but I think it's well worth occupying us with this because we'll get nowhere when it comes to empowering democracy if we do not compensate for what the Supreme Court has been doing over the last 40 or so years, even more than 40 years now, more like 45 years. And if we don't compensate for that and prevent any further movements over to the right by this Supreme Court, we will never recapture our democracy. Maybe I shouldn't say recapture. We will never create the true democracy that I think we were coming close to creating before the Supreme Court made the turn to the right during the late 1970s and the early 1980s, okay, as I would date it. So let me do this. Let me share this article by Tom Hartman with you. Hey, Kay, how you doing? Steve, thank you for asking everybody to smash the like button. Also smash the share button. Also smash the subscribe button if you are not already subscribed. Here's Tom's article up on the screen. I should say right now, I have a big disagreement with Tom Hartman, who generally speaking is, to my mind, a vote blue no matter who guy. And I am not that. But also, I do recognize that when it comes to work on where our democracy is, okay, at this point, and what the Supreme Court has done, Tom Hartman's done a lot of good work on that. And I think you'll find that again when we get into the details of this article. So, oh, by the way, it's been wonderful to be back this week. Uh, it's it's just been really fun and really wonderful. I took a couple of flights this past weekend that reminded me again of the damage Republicans on the Supreme Court did to America when they legalized political bribery. The good news is that there are numerous things Congress can do to undo the court's bizarre doctrine that money is the same thing as free speech and corporations have Bill of Rights freedoms and protections, okay, as persons. That is, to my mind, a very good short statement of what the Supreme Court has done in this very significant area. Uh, it's had all sorts of implications over a very, very long time. I have to say myself, based on who the founders were and what they wrote and what they did, the idea that money is the same thing as free speech would have been anathema to them. I don't even think the slaveholders believed that money was the same thing as free speech. It is a bizarre doctrine, and it goes against the whole history of constitutional law. And the idea that these right-wing judges, okay, are originalists, that is a total lie. They do not respect the Constitution and its foundations. Going forward with what Tom has to say, neither of these, quote, rights to bribe, unquote, by the morbidly rich and corporations were recognized in the early years of our republic. Even today, we're unique among advanced democracies. I guess I have to argue with characterizing us as an advanced democracy in holding the Supreme Court created doctrines which underpin much, if not most, of today's political corruption. And there, of course, we come again to dump the corruption. Congress has never, in the history of the United States, passed a law saying rich people buying politicians is the same thing as free speech, or that corporations have a right to bribe politicians and lie to the public. To the contrary, says Tom, Congress has passed hundreds of laws which were overturned by these three Supreme Court decisions regulating money in politics and criminalizing political corruption. The courts inventing these twin doctrines have even corrupted the other two branches of government, leading today to legislative paralysis and erosion of civil and voting rights and widespread public cynicism. I think that Tom is right on with what's happened, okay, and with calling out the role of public cynicism in undermining our democracy. The executive branch of our government has done a lot of damage over the past 5 decades, from Nixon committing treason to blow up LBJ's 1968 peace talks with Vietnam, so he could beat VP Humphrey in the 1968 elections, to Reagan's massive tax cuts and defunding of our schools and colleges, to Bush's two illegal and unnecessary $8 trillion wars, to Trump's burning spies by passing classified information along to Russian intelligence while president. I think those are largely accurate. I'd like to see more argument from Tom on Trump's burning spies by passing classified information along to Russian intelligence. Other than that, I think that paragraph contains flat statements of the truth, including Nixon committing treason to blow up LBJ's 1968 peace talks with Vietnam. He clearly did that. And why LBJ did not immediately have him arrested and jailed and indicted for that, I do not know. I don't think there was any excuse not to do that, especially with LBJ already announcing that he wasn't going to run again. I think Nixon's actions in that respect, were unacceptable. And from the fruit of that poison tree, lots of evil ensued, including the appointment of Lewis Powell to the Supreme Court, which I'm sure will come up in this story a little bit later. Because, of course, Nixon appointed Lewis Powell to the Supreme Court. Now, the legislative branch has also played a role in most of those fiascos and crimes, as well as the current Republican circus in the House of Representatives. During the Bush presidency, they passed legislation allowing for more pollution, the Clear Skies Act, getting around environmental rules that protect our forests, the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, and defunding the IRS and the EPA, the perennial enemies of the fossil fuel industry and their billionaires who own the GOP. I have to say about that paragraph, that's a clear statement of fact as well. That's what happened during the Bush presidency. But all the treachery of both branches pales in comparison to the damage the U.S. Supreme Court has done to our country ever since Richard Nixon put Lewis Powell, author of the infamous Powell Memo, quote unquote, that told billionaires how to take over American media, courts, colleges, and seize ownership of our politicians on the court. And it began its long swing to the hard right. And Tom is right to point that out too. That appointment to the Supreme Court was absolutely critical. And the spreading of the Powell Memo all over the place was also critical in changing the politics of the United States. In fact, it was Powell's work and influence on the court that made possible the corruption of the executive and legislative branches mentioned above. Most people know that the Republicans on the Supreme Court, beginning with the Powell-Rehnquist eras, began an aggressive war on unions, consumer protections, voting rights, and civil rights. But few realize that those Supreme Court doctrines are responsible for the deaths of 2,977 innocent people on 9/11. I flew to Michigan earlier this week because my niece was dying from what I consider medical malpractice in a hospital cutting back on staffing to support the millions paid to its senior executives, which is another problem facilitated by the Supreme Court, although that's a story for another time. On the flights, though, I again noticed the cockpit doors were fully hardened. I've been a licensed pilot since 1972, so I tend to notice what's going on with airplanes and jets. The doors to the cockpits were sheathed with what looked like stainless steel, securely locked, and each had a keypad with a secure PIN code necessary to gain entry. There's a backstory here that explains everything from the success. Hang on a second, folks. I just want to check out something. There's a backstory here that explains everything from the success of the 9/11 attackers to why the train crash in Ohio last week happened and was allowed to poison the community, and it all tracks back to corrupt Republicans on the Supreme Court. Back in the day, if you're old enough to remember or a fan of newspaper archives, there was a rash of hijackings of planes, mostly to Cuba. Got so bad that in December of 1968, kicking off the holiday travel season, Time magazine ran an article titled "What to Do When the Hijacker Comes." Just between 1968 and 1972, there were more than 130 airplane hijackings in the United States. On a few occasions, there was more than one a day. Were the hijackings to Cuba and other destinations, while the hijackings to Cuba and other destinations largely petered out in the early 1970s, passengers crashing cockpit doors persisted for decades. In just the 2 years before 9/11, for example, there were 30 different times airline cockpits were breached by passengers. In one case in 2000, other passengers restraining a man trying to get to a Southwest Airlines plane's controls accidentally suffocated him to death. A few months later, a British Airways 747 passenger breached the cockpit door, severely bit the captain's ear, disengaged the autopilot, and threw the plane into a 10,000-foot dive before the co-pilot was able to regain control. Airline pilots, their unions, and passenger groups had been begging the airlines to harden their cockpit doors since the 1960s. They were flimsy enough to be kicked in, but doing so would have cost $100,000 or more per plane, and the airlines really didn't want to spend the money. In 1996, Vice President Al Gore convened the White House Commission on Aviation Safety and Security, and witnesses suggested hardening cockpit doors to securely keep pilots separate from passengers. Word leaked along with a preliminary report in September of that year, though, and the airline's lobbyists jumped to the task. The Supreme Court, after all, had authorized them to pass out as much money to politicians in their campaigns as they wanted. Vice President Gore quickly backed away from the expensive proposition of hardening airline doors, writing a groveling letter to Carol Hallett, president of the airline's lobbying group, the Air Transport Association, saying, quote, "I want to make it very clear that is not the intent of this administration or of the commission to create a hardship for the air transportation industry," unquote, and adding that the Clinton administration and the airlines could work in, quote, "in full partnership," unquote. The next day, according to media reports, TWA donated $40,000, nearly $100,000 in today's dollars to the DNC. Over the following month, American, United, Delta, and Northwest similarly threw money at the Clinton administration. The total haul was, according to the Center for Responsive Politics, $627,000, $1.2 million in today's money. All of this was completely legal. And by then, 21 years after Lewis Powell and his buddies on the Supreme Court had legalized political bribery, pretty routine. As I read that, I noticed that Lewis Powell here was spelled Louis, Lewis. If I recall correctly, someone might want to check me on this or check the article on this. The spelling of Lewis' name is Lewis. And his buddies on the Supreme Court had legalized political bribery, pretty routine. Both political parties took these kinds of bribes every day, since internet fundraising wasn't yet a thing. And to paraphrase Willie Sutton, corporations were where the money was. The result was airline doors weren't hardened, so on 9/11, the mostly Saudi hijackers were able to easily breach the cockpits, kill the pilots and co-pilots, and take over the planes. How did we get here? Asked Tom Hartman. In 1978, a decision authored by Lewis Powell himself, and there Lewis is spelled correctly, the majority Republicans on the Supreme Court ruled in their bloody decision that corporations giving money to politicians, essentially bribing them, was the same thing as your First Amendment protected right to free speech. They ruled corporations could bribe politicians with their, quote, free speech, unquote, money, because they said corporations are, quote, persons, unquote, and therefore have free speech rights under the First Amendment to the Constitution. I have to comment here. The founding fathers would have found that to be anathema, because largely, in the heavy majority, they hated corporations. They came very close to banning corporations under the Constitution of the United States. They hated them so much, largely because they hated the British East India Company, which is the most notorious corporation of that age. This was certainly not in the original Constitution. The idea that corporations were equivalent as persons to human beings would have been anathema to the founders. After all, they wouldn't even count the blacks living in the United States as persons. They were only 3/5 persons. So do you think they would have allowed corporations to be full persons? No way. As a result, by 1996, the airlines could legally shower money on Clinton, Gore, and both parties in Congress, convincing them that requiring airlines to harden their cockpit doors was, quote, excessive big government, like a regulation, unquote. Which is why when Mohammed Atta and his merry band of Saudis hijacked the airliners on 9/11, they were able to make their way into the cockpits, kill the pilots and co-pilots, and fly the jets straight into the World Trade Center, and the Pentagon. By the way, I thought that was a very clever reconstruction of what allowed the Saudis to get into the cockpits and to trace it back to a decision by the Supreme Court. That was really a brilliant exercise by Tom, in my view. It's hard to overstate how much damage these corrupt rulings by the Republicans on the court, from Buckley and also Bellotti, 1976, 1978, to Citizens United in 2010, have done to American democracy, our nation, and our people. With the blessing of the Supreme Court, billionaire ideologues have paid off politicians, most Republicans, but a few, quote, problem solver, unquote, Democratic shills as well, too. And here's a list of damage caused by the Supreme Court. Gut our public schools to make way for billionaire and church-funded, mostly all-white private schools. Privatize public electric and water utilities so billionaires can make money on life's essentials. End government subsidies for college to keep education as a bar only wealthy people can easily jump over. Keep their own taxes so low that most billionaires pay 3% income taxes or less. Raise the Social Security retirement age to 67 and start privatizing Medicare through the Medicare Advantage scam, and I might add, the Accountable Care Organization scam as well, the ACO REACH, it's called. It's a new program started under the Trump administration, continued by the Biden administration, to allow the private sector companies to lower the cost ratio of money spent on patients versus money spent on overhead, okay, and profits. The Medicare Advantage program lowered that ratio to 85% of revenues the health insurance companies get. Okay, that ratio for Medicare, by the way, is only 2% for the Medicare program. The ACO REACH program is in the process of lowering the ratio to 60% and even lower to between 50 and 60%. So private insurance companies can spend as little as 50% of what they collect on patient care. Going on. Sell off public lands for pennies on the dollar to mining and drilling interests. Fight efforts to force chemical and fossil fuel companies to clean up their own toxic dumps. Allow banks, airlines, and hospitals, among others, to nickel and dime us to death. Ship our factories and jobs overseas. Defund the IRS so it can't afford to audit billionaires. Make it harder for low-income workers, folks on Social Security, and students to vote. Purge tens of millions of Democratic voters from voting rolls just before elections, the way Jeb Bush handed Florida to his brother with a 537 vote margin after purging 20,000 African Americans from the rolls in the months before November 2000. Gerrymander states along racial lines to ensure white rule and make it hard to break up the monopolies. Tom points out, none of these things were supported by a majority of voters. All were gifts to special interests who'd greased the palms of Congress with cash legalized by 5 Republicans on the Supreme Court. And of course, now we have 6 Republicans on the U.S. Supreme Court. So, what can we do about the crisis of our democracy? Asked Tom. It turns out there are actually multiple ways Congress can deal with this problem. The first is to subject the Supreme Court to the same ethics rules every other federal judge must follow. For example, Clarence Thomas' wife was directly involved in Trump's effort to overturn the 2020 election, but Thomas, and only Thomas, ruled that Trump's treasonous efforts to stay in the White House, and they were treasonous efforts, even though he lost the election, should be considered by the court itself. Had there been ethics in place, Thomas would have been forced to recuse himself, but the court has held for years that it doesn't want to abide by such ethical guidelines. Congress has the power to impose ethics rules on the court for the simple reason that the Constitution puts Congress over the court. Article 3, Section 2, which I've talked about quite a lot here, and Tom has talked about this all along also, clearly states, quote, "The Supreme Court shall have appellate jurisdiction, both as to law and fact, with such exceptions and under such regulations as the Congress shall make," unquote. Congress could also, quote, "regulate," unquote, the Supreme Court to mandate live cameras for all proceedings so they'd be available live on the internet or C-SPAN. But the most powerful and controversial thing Congress could do is to pass legislation stripping from the court the power to proclaim that corporations are, quote, "persons," unquote, and money is the same thing as free speech. This is not a wacky left-wing theory, by the way. And this next part, of course, is really stunning. President Ronald Reagan hired into the White House 2 well-known right-wing lawyers to try to figure out a way Congress, which Republicans also controlled at the time, could overturn the Supreme Court's Brown versus desegregation decision and Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion nationwide. I have to correct something there. When Reagan came in, the Republicans took over the Senate for a little while, during the 1980s, before it reverted to the Democrats. But they didn't control Congress because the House remained a Democratic House until 1995, when the Republicans under Gingrich took over the majority in the House. So for the whole Reagan administration, the House was still Democratic. And the Speaker at the time that Reagan came in, of course, was Tip O'Neill of Massachusetts. So there's a factual error in this. Anyway, Reagan hired 2 well-known right-wing lawyers to try to figure out a way Congress could overturn the Supreme Court's Brown versus Board of Education decision and Roe v. Wade, which legalized abortion nationwide. Good to remember that Reagan was after Roe v. Wade, was after having legalized abortion, and that he was after Brown versus Board of Education desegregation decision. Who do you suppose these right-wing justices were? I'm sorry, these right-wing lawyers were. Young right-wing lawyers, well known. Tom continues. Their names were Samuel Alito and John Roberts, and both were enthusiastic about their mission to get around the Supreme Court's, quote, liberal decisions about race and abortion. There's quotes around the liberal there. At the end of this article, I've summarized and quoted Roberts' logic about how Congress could blow Citizens United out of the water without amending the Constitution, if you want to get into the nerdy details, which I find fascinating, says Tom. I find those fascinating too. In summary, though, Roberts argued to Reagan that if they really wanted to press the issue of overturning Roe and Brown, Congress could simply pass legislation citing Article 3, Section 2, and specifically saying that Roe and Brown were null and void and that the Supreme Court was exempted from ruling on issues surrounding racial segregation or abortion. If Democrats were to adopt John Roberts' logic, they could go a long way toward stripping out of our political systems the money corruption that the Supreme Court introduced with Buckley, Bellotti, and Citizens United. The final two ways the Biden administration and Congress could overturn the court's legalization of political bribery, both of which have been discussed in the media extensively, are: one, to use their power to regulate the court by adding more members. There are 13 circuit courts at the moment, and historically the Supreme Court often had as many members as there were circuit courts. A 13-member court could probably work far better than its current small size. I comment on that frequently myself and point out it really doesn't matter what the number of circuit courts are at this moment or were at some earlier moment. The point is, Congress has the power to add members to the Supreme Court. My own proposal is that we should have a 15-member Supreme Court, and 6 more justices should be appointed immediately, if, of course, we could get, I should say we, if, of course, Democrats could get the House back. But, okay, I think it's doubtful to get the House back. I think the odds are it's going to lose the election. Okay, the Democrats are going to lose the election of 2024, and that they'll be lucky to retain the Senate. They may still retain the Senate, but to my mind, the election prospects are looking very bad now. We haven't yet seen the impact that a big victory for the Russians in Ukraine is likely to have on domestic politics here. But such a victory will expose the bankrupt foreign policy of the Biden administration. And I think it's likely to blow up the politics of 2024 considerably. And it's likely to create a situation where, unless our Dump the Corruption campaign is successful, the White House is likely to fall into the waiting hands of Donald Trump once again. To pass a constitutional amendment overturning Citizens United by explicitly declaring that money is not the same thing as speech and corporations are not entitled to protections of persons under the Bill of Rights. This would require approval of 2/3 of each body of Congress and 3/4 of the states to be put into the Constitution. And by the way, I always comment on that by saying, as I'll say here, to get that amendment, such an amendment passed, would take at least 7 years. And we need to have a declaration that money is not the same thing as speech and corporations are not entitled to protections of persons under the Bill of Rights right now. So that means the earlier way that Tom discussed, we need the Congress to pass a law asserting those things and to strip the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court over that law or any laws having to do with money, okay, in politics, or money as the same thing as speech, okay, or granting to corporations the protections of persons under the Bill of Rights. They simply have to be cut out of that game because they have done the wrong thing and it has been killing our democracy. Tom goes on, neither of these will happen any day soon, particularly given the current composition of Congress. Of course, and again, that's why we need to dump the corruption. In order to dump anything like the current composition of Congress, the survey that I and Caitlin Mallard have been doing of the members of the Congressional Progressive Caucus has indicated that not one of them could pass the litmus test related to money in politics. I will state now for you the litmus test rule. It is vote against every candidate except those who won't take money from wealthy corporations, individuals, PACs, or party committees, and who won't repudiate super PAC support for themselves. That's the rule. So far, we've covered almost every member of the CPC. We'll probably complete the rest of the CPC in tomorrow's show, but we don't even have one candidate yet, one incumbent yet, who would pass that litmus test. So going back now to Tom's article, but similarly, it's unlikely Congress or even this administration has much appetite to try John Roberts' strategy of barring the court from his whole cloth invention of the twin doctrines of corporate personhood and legal political bribery, but the harms continue to accumulate, and here they are. Quote, the Supreme Court, for example, overrode Congress and the president, giving red states the power to opt out of Medicaid expansion and leaving millions without health insurance. People have died because of that decision based on the thinnest and most bizarre interpretation of the Constitution. They gutted the Voting Rights and the Civil Rights Act, keeping Republicans in control of Congress, even when Democrats win the majority of votes nationwide. The billionaires pay 3% income taxes with impunity because of these corrupt Supreme Court decisions allowing the morbidly rich to bribe politicians. We must prepare to act when the opportunity to solve this crisis of our political system presents itself. If American democracy is to become truly functional, if the will of the majority is to be put into law while corporate and billionaire power are reduced, now is the time to begin working out strategies for the next time Democrats control both Congress and the White House. Thank you for reading the Hartman Report. This post is public, so feel free to share it. I've left the link to this article, in the description, so you can get that. I don't have too much time left here, but I want to go over the attachment containing Roberts' own logic. because, of course, he is still the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. So here's the summary of his argument to Reagan about how Congress can overrule the Supreme Court using Article 3, Section 2. And this is as summarized from Tom's book, The Hidden History of the Supreme Court and the Betrayal of America. And I guess it's fair to say this article was something of a condensation of that book. Reagan, via his counselor to the Attorney General, Ken Starr, tasked Roberts with reviewing the entire history of the U.S. Supreme Court for cases that suggested a legislative or administrative way to overturn Roe v. Wade and Brown v. Board. In response, Roberts wrote an extraordinary 27-page document, which is linked to in this article, that is largely unknown, in the form of a memo on the letterhead of the Office of the Attorney General to Ken Starr, signed by Roberts as Special Assistant to the Attorney General. It is titled, quote, Proposals to divest the Supreme Court of Appellate Jurisdiction, okay, an analysis in light of recent developments, unquote. Roberts wrote that he had found over 20 bills then pending in Congress, which would divest the Supreme Court and in most instances lower federal court as well as jurisdiction to hear certain types of controversies ranging from school prayer and desegregation cases to abortion cases. What Roberts and his researchers had discovered was substantial. Blocking the court from ruling on desegregation, abortion, or even legalizing political bribery is based on the exceptions clause of Article 3, Section 2 of the Constitution mentioned a moment ago, which stipulates that the court's powers exists, quote, with such exceptions, and under such regulations as the Congress shall make, unquote. Roberts noted in his memo, the exceptions clause by its term contains no limit. This clear and unequivocal language is the strongest argument in favor of congressional power and the inevitable stumbling block for those who would read the clause in a more restricted fashion. Roberts concluded with a 1968 comment from Senator Sam Ervin of North Carolina, one of the Senate's most outspoken opponents of racial integration, and abortion, and biggest supporters of apartheid, South Africa. Now Sam Ervin, who is most known for his role in the Watergate hearings and for his wonderful work during those hearings, I believe that there's another fact check here, because I think that Senator Sam Ervin was from South Carolina and not from North Carolina, but please someone check me on that, or I will do it before next time. Anyway, Roberts wrote to Reagan, as Senator Ervin noted during hearings on the exception clause, quote, I don't believe that the founding fathers could have found any simpler words or plainer words in the English language to say what they said, which was that the appellate jurisdiction of the Supreme Court is dependent entirely upon the will of Congress. Roberts agreed with Ervin. The Constitution was clear. Congress could limit the scope of the Supreme Court in rulings. Quote, we are not considering a constitutional clause that is by its nature indeterminate and incapable of precise or fixed meaning, such as the Due Process Clause or the prohibition on unreasonable searches and seizures. This was clearly the founders and framers' original intent, Roberts argued, because, quote, the exceptions clause, quote, again, was not debated, unquote, by the Committee of Detail which drafted it or the whole convention, unquote. Citing Federalist 81, Roberts wrote, quote, Hamilton noted that the clause would enable, quote, the government to modify appellate jurisdiction in such a manner as will best answer the ends of public justice and security, unquote, and that appellate jurisdiction was, quote, subject to any exceptions and regulations which may be thought advisable. Section 3 of Roberts' paper for Reagan on Congress overriding the court dives deep into Supreme Court decisions to find precedential rulings explicitly saying that Congress can regulate the federal courts and block the Supreme Court from ruling on particular issues. Beginning with the 1869 decision, ex parte McArdle, Roberts wrote, quote, a unanimous court upheld the power of Congress to divest the Supreme Court of jurisdiction. The court clearly based its decision on Congress' power under the Exceptions Clause. Chief Justice Chase began the opinion by recognizing that the appellate jurisdiction of the court is conferred with such exception, with quote, with such exceptions and under such by regulations as Congress shall make, unquote, and unquote. Quoting former Chief Justice Chase again, Roberts added his own emphasis, quote, we are not at liberty to inquire into the motives of the legislature. We can only examine into its power under the Constitution, and the power to make exceptions to the appellate jurisdiction of this court is given by express words. He continued his historical expose of court stripping with another 1869 decision, ex parte Yerger, and then United States versus Klein in 1872, Wiscott versus Douchy in 1796, DeRusso versus the United States in 1810, Daniels versus Railroad in 1865, and the Francis Wright, 1881. In the Francis Wright, Roberts found that Chief Justice Morrison R. Waite, whose court oversaw the infamous 1886, quote, corporate personhood, unquote, Santa Clara County versus Southern Pacific Railroad case, wrote for unanimous court, quoting him as follows, quote, not only may whole classes of cases be kept out of the jurisdiction altogether because of congressional restrictions, but particular classes of questions may be subjected to re-examination and review, while others are not, unquote. Each case strengthened the idea that Congress could simply pass a law without even needing a supermajority that barred the Supreme Court from ruling on a set of issues like Reagan, hot-button issues of school desegregation and abortion, or today on legalizing political bribery. Moving towards late 19th century decisions, Roberts quoted the court in Colorado Central Consolidated Mining Company versus Turk, 1893. It has been held in an uninterrupted series of decisions that this court exercises appellate jurisdiction only in accordance with the acts of Congress upon the subject, unquote. Roberts, in his own voice, added, quote, again, it bears emphasis that the basis for this theory is the implicit exercise by Congress of its exceptions power. Still building his case, Roberts jumped into 20th century rulings, starting with National Mutual Insurance Company versus Tidewater Transfer, 1948. Writing for the majority, Justice Felix Frankfurter noted in a decision, quote, Congress need not give this court any appellate power. It may withdraw appellate jurisdiction once conferred, and it may do so even while a case is sub judice, even while a case is currently being considered, in other words. About the 1954 Yackas versus United States case, Roberts wrote, quote, Justice Rutledge noted that Congress has plenary power to confer or withheld appellate jurisdiction. Regarding Flast versus Cone in 1968, Roberts quoted from Justice William O. Douglas, who wrote, quote, "As respects our appellate jurisdiction, Congress may largely fasten it as Congress desires by reason of the express provisions, Section 2, Article 3, C. Ex parte McCardle," unquote. In Section 4 of his memo, Roberts again covered the span from the framing of the Constitution to the time of his writing the memo, quoting another dozen or so cases that referenced less directly the power of Congress to exempt the court from certain issues or decisions. Roberts also noted that the original Judiciary Act of 1789, which created the federal court system, also explicitly refers to Congress' power of exception. And that covers the whole article. I wanted a comment, on the end. When the Supreme Court decided Citizens United in 2010, I believe the decision was in June of 2010. The Democrats still had a majority in the Senate, a huge majority in the Senate. At that time, it was something like, I believe, 59-41. And it also had a huge majority in the House, something like 247 to 178 or something like that. Nancy Pelosi in total control of the House. The instant the Supreme Court decision was laid down in Citizens United, the Obama administration and the Democrats could have combined to pass a law outlawing corporate personhood and outlining the right to politically bribe Congress, or the president, office holders, in general, candidates, in general. It could have done that the day after the Supreme Court decision, and then prohibited the Supreme Court from reviewing, from having jurisdiction over that act. And the country would have been spared the whole nightmare of Supreme Court actions from 2010 right up to this time. The Democrats had all the power in their hands, and they didn't even seem particularly concerned with the question. Didn't even seem particularly concerned with the grant of power to corporations inherent in the CU decision. How can that be? How can they have dropped the ball so severely and turned control over to the Republicans, even in relation to the election of 2010? The corporations were even then freed up to engage in unlimited funding during that congressional campaign. I think the Democrats probably would have been defeated anyway, because their performance in 2009 and 2010 was basically political malpractice. They handed the House over to the Republicans in 2011 by failing to pass a Medicare for All bill, and by wasting most of the 2009 and 2010 sessions on gearing up to pass a healthcare reform bill that they were actually unwilling to pass. Instead, they passed a giveaway to the corporations. That political malpractice doomed them in the election of 2010. That's why the Republicans won. The Republicans might have won anyway, but nevertheless, a lot of those contributions that came to the Republicans in 2010 would have been prohibited if the Democrats had passed the law that I just suggested. Now, I think this is a wonderful article. I love it. It talks about the solutions we could have if only we could get over the control of Congress that the wealthy and the corporations and the special interests have now by dint of their campaign contributions, by dint of the corruption that is already here and already fully developed in large part because of the Supreme Court decisions. And by the way, I'm not even talking much about, in this particular article, the actual corruption of the Supreme Court by political contributions made to campaigns to get certain of these justices onto the Supreme Court in the first place. We know that's another story, but it's a serious story because the court itself has been directly undermined by these political campaigns for the justices funded by the big money. But apart from that, the obvious connection to what we normally do here every day in this series is to the idea that the only way to get this money out of politics, even to use the methods outlined and suggested by Tom Hartman here, is to create and run and win a dump the corruption campaign by the time of the election of 2024 that guarantees the wholesale removal of any person in Congress and the presidency as well, who violates in their run for office the rule, the litmus test that I previously stated. The analysis we've been doing of the CPC incumbents shows that every one of them, even the new incumbents who were recently candidates, has violated the litmus test. Now, we'll be doing some analyses of Republicans and conservative Democrats as we go along also. Not too many, though. We're not going to go over all 435 members of Congress, but a sampling of the other Democrats and the Republicans should suffice, combined with the analyses of the CPC members, to indicate that there is not a single member of Congress who could pass our litmus test, which means if our campaign to dump the corruption is successful, that means that the election of 2024 would result in a defeat of all 435 members of Congress because they took the big money. We could, and hopefully we will, replace every one of the members of Congress and the President of the United States as well, and the challenger for the presidency of the United States as well, because you know the Republican challenger, being Donald Trump, will take enormous amounts of this big money and will, by virtue of that, be disqualified on the same basis as Joe Biden will if he wins the nomination. All the major parties candidates will be disqualified, and we will be looking at a third party election in 2024 if we bring this dream to fruition. It is a dream because we have to organize everybody in a mass movement to vote in that way. But we're going to do our best to do that. And we hope that you will come along with us on that, that we can change the Congress. We can constrain and leash the Supreme Court and end its threat to our democracy. And in this and other ways, empower democracy to go forward in America. That is what we need to do for the campaign of 2024. I will now check your comments for just a few minutes because I've worked hard in this particular stream. And I am ready to say goodnight, even right now. Steve Wolfbrand points out, Reagan had Alzheimer's like Biden. He certainly did. Building 7 voluntarily fell to the ground, not hit by anything. WTF? Steve was making a bunch of comments. He says, see architects and engineers for 9/11, Twin Towers and Building 7 were rigged for demolition. Kay Ryan says, Tom is a political historian. Yes, I know. And Kay, you have to know from this that I really do like Tom. I don't agree with him on the vote blue no matter who, of course. But I really think that Tom is an excellent analyst and has made wonderful contributions. And this, of course, among them. Steve Wolfbrand comments, Alan Dulles, killed JFK. Perhaps. Steve Wolfbrand says, we missed you, Doc. Kay says, I'm good, Joe. Hope you and Bonnie are too. Hey, Doc, what's the story behind the coup attempt on FDR by the billionaires? That's covered, in a number of books. I think Tom Hartman has covered that in some of his history also. But the basic outline story is that the coup attempt was blown by the general that the coup plotters decided to call upon to head the coup. His name is escaping me right now due to a senior moment, but he was a widely decorated general and very, very popular. And as soon as he heard about the coup attempt, he ran to Roosevelt. He told him about it. And the coup attempt, was quashed. Oh, I'm sorry. His name comes leaping to my mind now. It was General Smedley Butler, a widely decorated general, someone who was considered a real hero at that time. And he had the integrity to go to the FDR, and the administration to expose the plot. I personally think the coup plotters got off far too lightly. I don't know what FDR was thinking. I think he should have clapped them all in jail, charged them with treason, and put the fear of God into the whole millionaire class. So, by the way, I don't think it was a coup attempt by the billionaires. I don't think there were any billionaires. okay, at that time, as I recall. There were a number of people with hundreds of millions of dollars, of course, but I don't think there were any billionaires yet. Uh, okay, if you did a control uh, for the devaluation of the dollar since that time, then yes, uh, there were billionaires in that sense if you equalized the currency value. But just in terms of face value, I don't think there were any billionaires at that time. Kay, right? Kay says, yes, we did. That is Miss Me. Thank you, Kay. And thank you, Steve. And Steve says, nope, 9/11 was an inside job. Israel, CIA, George H.W. Bush do the research. I know there's a lot of research, okay, on that job, but whether it was an inside job or not, it couldn't have been done in just that way if those cockpits were hardened. In Tom's case, is that except for the money in politics, the airlines would have faced a legislation that would have forced them to harden those doors to the cockpits, and the hijackers would not have been able to get in. And so, even if the Twin Towers and Building 7 were rigged for demolition, there would have been no demolition taking place if the hijackers had not been able to fly the planes into the buildings. So there that is. Building 7 voluntarily fell to the ground, not hit by anything. What the WTF? Reagan had Alzheimer's like Biden. Yeah, that's right. Well, I think we're sort of at the end. As Steve says, I got to bounce too. Thank you all for coming. And I hope this will be widely shared and liked, because I think this was a very, very important stream. Thank you again for coming. I'm ending the broadcast.